Hi everyone, I just wanted to share how I created this little robot in Nomad Sculpt. This is not my idea. This actually comes from a great tutorial by a guy named Theo who did this in Blender. His YouTube channel Beyond Blender is very good, so I would recommend checking it out. So if you look at this robot, you can see it consists of many parts. So I thought I'd share how I created some of these parts. So I think the first thing to talk about is how I created the tire and the treads in Nomad. After watching the tutorial on Beyond Blender, kind of gave me some ideas on how I could tackle this in Nomad. So basically I just started with the torus. From there I created the shape and the width I wanted of the tire. After that I tried to figure out how am I going to create the treads. Well, masking is the first thing that came to mind. And one of the things is with the mask tool, you can use the radial symmetry and just increase the amounts and create even masks throughout the torus. But if you notice, it's kind of blurry, so you really do have to increase the subdivision level quite a bit. Even that is kind of not enough, so I increase it a little more. And now I can create a pretty sharp mask. I don't want it going to the middle because I want to create a groove in the center of the tire. But now we want to expand and push out. So I inverted the mask, and now I'm just scaling in one axis. The problem is it doesn't quite scale in the other axis. So if you look at the center of the tire, you can see it's not pushed out enough. So then you're going to use the gizmo and push it out so it's a little more even protrusion from the base geometry. Then I'm just going to use the crease tool and create a crease in the middle. And there you go. From here, there's just some fine tuning, mostly smoothing. I want to just smooth the ends of these little protrusions of the tire, or the treads of the tire, just to make it a little better. And there you go. The next part I thought I'd go over is the rim. The rim is just a simple lathe object. It's not validated. And you can change the points. You can either make them sharp or keep them round so you get the geometry you want. Also, because it's not validated, you can keep your geometry pretty low if you want. Next, I thought I'd go over how was the fender created. As you can see, the fender is just a hollow piece, almost looking like part of a cylinder, and that's exactly how we're going to create it. So after adding a cylinder, I'm going to rotate it using the snap function. And from here, I'm just going to adjust the shape. I want it a little thinner. Once validated, I'm going to clone the shape because I want to create that little half circle on the bottom of the fender. So it's just a question to adjusting the shape where you want, and then you're going to use a Boolean operation to create the hole. Once created, I'm going to use the trim tool in polygon mode to create the shape. And if you noticed, I created a lot of sharp points. Then I will subtract it and remove the geometry I don't want. It's a little jagged, so I'm going to increase the voxel. From here, it's just a question of cloning it, resizing it, and then subtracting it to get the hollow shape. This is where the X-ray function really comes in handy, especially if you want it to be a more uniform reduction. And there you go. There's your shape. I want to create a little bevel at the bottom. This is where I'm going to use the flatten tool and make sure the radial count is high enough so I get a nice uniform bevel. Then we'll quad remesh to lower the vertex count quite a bit. The next thing I thought I'd go over is how I created this little hubcap. As you can see up close, it has some unique curves to it. And they were created starting with a base sphere and just using the trim tool and cutting it in half. From there, I corrected the height. It was a little too high. And now how are we going to create those 4 grooves that go into this half sphere? And really, you're going to use Boolean operations. So I added a cylinder, I mirrored it, and then I just pushed it out to the side. And then from here, it's just a question of resizing it to get it the size and shape you want for the cutout. Once you have that done, it's just a question of duplicating it and rotating it. Now, what you need to do is to really join all 4 of these so they're one object. And then after you do that, you use a Boolean operation to create your geometry. And based on the resolution, you'll either get a little jaggedness or you won't. If you get a little jaggedness, just up the voxel count and remesh. So to create that indentation in the center, I'm going to show you 2 ways. One is using face groups. There's a YouTube channel called Making Things. And the gentleman who has this channel really has some great videos. And he had this video about what was new in version 1.85. And it really blew my mind how he could create detailed anatomy with very little geometry. So this is based on his tutorial. So you'll create your circular face group. And it might not be as smooth as you want. So you're going to select the smooth tool with relax checked and just smooth it. And it's amazing how the margin or the delineation gets so smooth. Now, make sure you have face group selected in the shading menu so you can see what's going on. And also in the quad remesher menu, that will preserve the face group. And now when you remesh, you can see it's a much better geometry to extrude or intrude. Now select the mask tool, invert it, and simply push in or push out. Look at that clean geometry it creates. From here, you can go and smooth some of these parts if they're not to your liking. An alternative method is to use masking. We'll get it to where we basically want it again. We'll do the Boolean operation to create the shape. And now we're going to mask. But you see it's too jagged. So what do we have to do? We have to increase the resolution. So increase the resolution a couple of times. Now you'll see it's a much better mask. And now you're going to erase the inner part. Now you basically invert and intrude. From here you can see it's a little jagged, but you can easily remesh or voxel remesh. This is where you're going to use symmetry and the radial count to smooth it very uniformly. And there's your result. But one thing I want to point out is the vertex count. It's almost 900,000. So we need to use the quad remesher. I chose 40,000, and this is just trial and error, and it preserved the shape beautifully. I also like to quad remesh as I finish each part. I like to keep the vertex count as low as possible while I'm working, so I don't get any slowdowns or possibly crashes with Nomad. For the next part, I'd like to create those intertwined big wires or cables that hold the head to the fender. And this is just simply using the tube tool, getting the shape you want. Now we go down to spiral and we check spiral. And you're going to change the angle to something that pleases you. Once you have that done, you can play around with some of the other sliders to get the exact shape you want. Next, I'm going to clone it, and I'm not going to move it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a setting in spiral called offset. And this will offset it so I can put it exactly where I want it and it'll be intertwined perfectly. And this tube tool and all these settings are quite amazing. Leaves anything to your imagination. It's a very, very powerful tool set. Next, I thought we'd talk about that little part that holds the light to the fender. Again, it's a very simple thing to do. I just used the tube tool. And here it is. It's quite low geometry. And that's how I want to keep it if possible. How I started, kind of the same way as I did before. And I'm going to change the profile this time because I want it a little thinner. From here, I just validate it and I scale it in the direction I want. And we're pretty much done. It's a very simple thing. If you want it round, you can round it later, but it's a very simple thing. And lastly, I thought we'd talk about the head. Now, since Nomad is a sculpting app, it doesn't really have polygonal tools, Boolean operations are how you're going to create these shapes. How I started was just with a basic cylinder, and after putting in the parameters and getting it where I wanted the proper way. If you notice, I'm using the arrow tool, the move arrow, because if you use scale, this happens. Notice stretch geometry though. How do you take care of the geometry when you stretch it? Well, you voxel remesh. And how do you create an outline of the head? Well, you just duplicate it, make it smaller, and then just subtract it from the base shape. And there you go. The first thing we need to do is duplicate this shape and shrink it inside the existing. So it looks like there are two layers. The inner layer will be the upper part of the mouth. So once we have that where we want it, let's create that little bow in the lower or outer ring. Now I've tried doing it where I had the length approximately where I wanted it, but I found it was too hard to maintain this even groove. So the one thing I did was I shrunk it. And now when I mask and when I pull down, if I set the radius high enough, it will do it fairly uniformly. From the side view, it might not be perfect, so this is where you can do slight refinements and get it to where you want it. Now I have the inner part as a guide so I can put it back to the length I wanted. And I could do the same for the inner shape as well, but you will not see the mouth from the back, so I'm okay with it just being raised up in the front. And there you go, and there is the head shape. Next is to create those little openings on the side of the head. Knowing I'm going to use a Boolean operation, I add a square and reshape it and angle it to the approximate size I want. But since the ends aren't ideal shape-wise, I'll just use the trim tool to create the shape I want. Once I put it in the approximate proper position, I just added an array modifier so I could keep things evenly spaced. Once I have them where I want them, I need to join them into one mesh. From here, it's the Boolean operation. Just make sure the voxels are high enough. So for the small groove in the front of the head, I decided to use the face group technique. I used the rectangle tool and select a very thin face group. From here, I then used the mask tool and mask it. After it's completely masked, I then invert it and resize to create the groove. After that, it's just a question of whether you want it smoothed out a little or a lot. And this is the head shape and how I created it. Now, I'm sure there are other ways, but this is how I did it. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you again.